for posterity and all that. So you can see yourself on YouTube later, if you, no, not later, in about a month's time. I'm very bad at uploading it. Hi, everybody. Please mute yourself if I haven't muted you already. Arthur, what are we talking about tonight?
We're going to talk about the next decade, what it holds, primarily from a technology point of view, but we can also talk about the trends that are shaping society. But I guess, whereas in the past, the interest would have been in what's happening in the next 10 years by 2030, these days the real interest is what's happening in the next year. In fact, by the end of 2020, what will the world look like? And by the end of 2021. So we'll talk quite a lot about the current scenario. I'll share some stats with you as well. And I'll show you some graphs that will give you a perspective on how the world is being reshaped. And I don't want to depress you, but I'll show you some stats to show you how bad things are in South Africa as well.
Okay, go for it. Blow us away, Arthur. Depress us completely.
And we'll keep this quite informal. We'll talk for the next 50 minutes or so. And if people want to ask questions or raise their hands, by all means. If you want to applaud, the reactions button allows you to applaud or to raise your thumb if you fully agree with what's being said. But by all means, if you want to discuss or put questions to me, you more than welcome to.
Yeah, they'll put them in the chat box and then I'll relay them to you for anybody who's not able to read because they're on their phones or something.
Great, excellent. So I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of a context for where we are and where we're headed in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and how long that impact will last, what the shape will be of the recovery. And I'm talking here very broadly. This will apply very much to the business world and to the technology world, but ultimately it will also apply to people's experience of how the recession hits us and how long it'll take to come out of it. So these aren't forecasts of exactly what will happen when, but this is really a trend line of what we can expect the shape of the future to be. I like to talk about the shape of the future. And this graph I'm going to show you now, in fact, is a perfect shape of the near future. So I'm going to share screen with you quickly to show you this graph. This is produced by the IDC, the International Data Corporation. They're a global research organization that I work with fairly regularly. And their local or their sub-Saharan head of analysis, Mark Walker, shared this graph with me and gave me permission to use it in my presentations. So just for full credit there, I can now talk you through my perspective on this graph. Mark has his own views on it. So my perspective is that what we are seeing now is that we, in the early stages of the crisis, people who think that it's now all over because lockdown went from phase 5 to 4 to 3, mustn't think that that also reflects a return to normalcy. In fact, things are going to get worse before they get better. And a lot of the projections suggest that the peak of the infections in South Africa is going to be in September. Strictly speaking, we should be going into stricter lockdown, not coming out of lockdown, as unpalatable as that sounds for people. But in the meantime, we've seen a massive blow to economies the world over. And that kind of blow doesn't just right itself once the factors behind it are sorted out. So even if the pandemic does plateau in September and we start coming out of the pandemic as such, the economy continues to decline because of the massive negative forces that have been brought to bear on it. So we're going to see that line carry on going down. Economies globally slowing down until we're in a great recession. According to the current numbers, we're already in deep recession. A recession technically is, I think, when we have 2 consecutive quarters of slowdown of growth, or at least contraction of the economy. So we've only really seen the last quarter as a major contraction. So technically, some would argue that we hadn't yet entered that recession, but we know we have, because we know that this quarter and the next quarter will also see massive negative growth, or rather contraction of the economy. So we still headed into that full-blown recession, and no ordinary recession either. This will be one of the great recessions, equivalent to the 1930s.
This is getting better and better, Arthur. Thank you.
I just wanted to cheer you up a little there, that you're living through history. It's not just a knock to the economy. It truly is a historically significant recession. And from a business point of view, the focus in the first few months was on business continuity, as the IDC put it. As the economy slows down, businesses will be looking on the return on their investment in technology and other areas of spending. They want to know that the people they employ are going to be productive and enable the business to survive. And once we are deep in the recession, then it's all going to be about business survival. But beyond just business continuity, the continuity we're talking about at the top is really the continuity of just keeping the business going, in terms of remote working and digital platforms and the like. The business resiliency at the bottom is the very survival of the business, whether it actually comes out of the recession or not. So that'll be the massive focus that we're going to see. And the result of that is also going to be massive layoffs of people as businesses try to manage their cash reserves or their debt or whatever they use to finance the business. Large workforces are not going to be sustainable for most businesses. So we'll see massive unemployment as a result of that, on top of the massive unemployment that we've already experienced. And that will then multiply the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the economy, because fewer people with jobs means less disposable income, less being spent on consumer goods, and therefore businesses coming under even greater strain, large and small businesses coming under greater strain. So we have seen tremendous levels of closure of business in the last few months, and we're going to see far more of that happening as the recession continues. And then gradually, as a vaccine is proven for COVID-19, and as the world develops immunity, and as we come out of lockdown completely, which looks like it might be sooner than the worst predictions because of all the advanced trials of vaccines, it means that businesses will start being able to operate more as normal. But bear in mind that they're operating in an environment where far fewer people have jobs, and therefore far less money is being spent. So only the very tightly managed business is really going to survive or thrive in that kind of environment. And investments in technology and in people is going to be highly targeted. But that's what will bring businesses back to growth. Those that survive will come back to growth. And those that serve new needs that emerge will also grow strongly in that period. And with a great deal of luck, this will happen in the course of next year. It certainly won't happen this year. One of the things that can shift that particular trend line is the level of government stimulus. And we've seen massive amounts of money going into various forms of stimulus. In South Africa, everything from UIF, TIRS, which is the relief funds from the UIF, through to the support of particular sectors and particular solidarity type payouts and the like. Those all help to buck that trend. They all help us to recover a little sooner. In the United States, they talk about the structural interventions. and quantitative easing and the like. And trillions of dollars have gone into that as well. And those trillions of dollars are actually what's been holding the stock market up. As you've probably seen, the stock market in the United States is at record highs. It's really booming. It's completely counter to the idea of there being a recession. But that's because so much money is being pumped into the economy and into people's pockets. Even those who aren't suffering are getting funding from government. And that money has to go somewhere. And much of it is going into the stock market. So you're seeing an unprecedented stock market boom, but also a totally irrational stock market boom, because the bottom is going to fall out of that market before long. That is my expectation, not my prediction, my expectation. I would invest in certain shares, but I certainly wouldn't invest in the rising stock market as such. So one's got to target very carefully where you would invest. And then finally, once we recover from all of this, we're going to find that almost every business, every large business certainly, and most small businesses will be operating on digital platforms. Much of their revenue will be based on digital income and digital processes. So the emphasis that we have today on physical labor, physical work, physical products and processes will, to a large extent, give way to digital products and the like. So already, by a quick show of hands, how many of you are using Netflix? How many of you watch Netflix, should I say? So I can't see everyone here. I'm going to try. Okay, a few of you are watching Netflix. How many of you use Spotify, for example? Anyone on Spotify? Okay, a few suspects on Spotify as well. So if I went through all of those digital services, those are all services that 4 years ago none of you were using, partly because they weren't available in South Africa, but also because at that stage, physical viewing products like DVDs or DSTV or the like, and listening products like CDs and the like were the preferred way of consuming entertainment. All of that has gone digital. The idea of relying on physical products to be entertained is so 2016 that we can barely remember it. It was really part of a previous life. So now extrapolate that, the idea that your entertainment has gone completely digital, into a range of other products as well. And that starts telling you the extent to which our lives are going to be primarily digital in the future. In the same way that we experience it now in lockdown with Zoom meetings, Zoom presentations, webinars like this, but also Zoom family occasions. That's going to be a standard part of our lifestyle through the rest of this decade, accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis. But it was coming all along. In the same way that it didn't take a crisis for us to move from CDs to Spotify or from DSTV to Netflix. These kind of tools would have emerged anyway without the crisis. The crisis has accelerated it, and that's what's really changed our experience of the future. We feel that things are advancing so fast now that it wasn't happening this way before. Well, all of these things were advancing previously. We just weren't being forced to be part of it. Now we're all part of that advance, and we are having to buy into it because we don't have a choice in the matter, whereas previously we could resist it if we felt the pace of change was too fast. I'm going to stop sharing that now for the moment. And what I want to do next is take you through some of the statistics that underpin what's happening in South Africa right now. And then from there, I'll start talking about technology. But just to give you a sense of where we're at in South Africa. And then I'm going to do a screen share of that as well. Okay, so this is based on research conducted by Stats SA. They do a monthly survey amongst consumers as well as businesses. But it's an online survey. So this applies to people who are mostly employed. 80% of respondents were full-time employed or self-employed, and also educated. 81% tertiary or post-school education. So I suppose something like the people in this audience. And this is how I sum up the big picture of what's emerged from the studies. It's health, wealth, and happiness. And that is actually summing up the crisis that we have right now. It's a crisis of health, it's a crisis of wealth, and it's a crisis of happiness. And all of us are keenly aware of those three crises. So this is what the health crisis looks like in South Africa. When people are asked about their concern about the impact of COVID-19, look at the 1 second from the bottom. Something like 60%, so you add the yellow and the gray to get people who are very or extremely concerned, 60% were deeply concerned about their own health. And then just above that, a little more than that if you combine the two. So something like 68% were concerned about the health of household members. And then if you go right to the top, you find that the vast majority are concerned with the health of vulnerable persons and with COVID-19 contributing to economic collapse. So you can see deep concerns about health across the population. Now this applied, as I said, to educated and employed people, but certainly that will also be the experience of the majority of the population. From a wealth point of view, this is a question of how people manage to minimize their risk of exposure to coronavirus by different means. And the one that, so all of them are fairly obvious, like avoiding crowded places, practicing social distancing, only leaving the house for essential reasons. But I want to go down to second from the bottom. 73% were able to do so by working from home. So that's almost 3/4 of the educated employed population who are able to continue working from home. And that actually sums up the wealth divide in South Africa. There's a massive digital divide in the past between those who had access to the internet and those who didn't. That divide has now manifested itself as the divide between those who are able to continue working. And as this shows, that's 3/4 of employed, educated people versus those who couldn't. And as we know, the vast majority of manual workers and low-level workers weren't able to continue working. So it tells you that the truly privileged were able to maintain their privilege. Bear in mind, again, that's 3/4 of the privileged. So 1 in 4 is not in that happy position. So you may say, hey, but that doesn't apply to me. And yes, you one of the 1 in 4, or part of the 1 in 4, to whom that doesn't apply necessarily. But I thought that particular stat of 73% working from home, or 3/4 working from home, is incredibly telling about our society and incredibly telling about what it takes to continue working. So what it also emphasizes is, in the same way I was talking earlier about businesses that have to go digital, people also have to be able to go digital in order to have their own form of business continuity, which is continuing to work in an online environment, because you've not just embraced digital tools, but also digital means of conducting your business. And then we've had health, wealth, and our happiness. And this really symbolizes the dearth of happiness. This is a fascinating question for Stats SA to ask. They ask people if they've hugged, kissed, or shook hands with non-household members outside their homes. And this is broken down by age group. And here you can see how age is in indirect proportion to happiness when it comes to actual physical contact. To me, being able to hug people or have physical contact with people is really a proxy for happiness. And look how low it is, firstly. Across the board, 4.7% of South Africans were able to hug, kiss, or shake hands with a non-household member outside their homes. The question should be, were you able to hug people inside your home? But then obviously, most people who have family members are able to do that. So that's one form of happiness, but it's an insular kind of happiness. In terms of external happiness and societal happiness, to me, the hug sums it up. And the happiest were the younger, under 35s, who were twice as happy, in fact, 5 times as happy as the over 65s. If you look at that, only 1.4% of over 65s were able to do the same, for many reasons, among other being the fact that they're more vulnerable, so it was more important for them to keep socially distanced. And also, very often you find people who are in post-retirement age are either living by themselves or living in fairly isolated circumstances. So that contributes to it as well. So you may well find that if you ask the same question in normal times, the shape of the graph would look the same. But it's the proportion of people in those age groups who are able to experience that kind of happiness that is the truly distressing aspect of what we're going through. So that's all the bad news. And that's basically, just hold on a second.
Does that mean there's actually good news?
The rest is not necessarily good news, but it is, I'm just having difficulty. Okay, there we go. Not necessarily good news, but at least they're more neutral trends, you could say. So the idea was to just give you a sense of what the background scenario is. So what I'm actually going to show you now are a few more trends that are going to shape society. And some of them have negatives built in, but it also shows you how some are responding to that. So now I'm going to move to in the wake of lockdown, the office clearly is no longer what it was before. And I'm going to show you the shape of the new office. This is what the corporate boardroom looks like today. Surprise, surprise. If it didn't look like that, you'd have to ask questions of the organization. But this is what surveys and commentators have told us. Firstly, already by the third quarter of last year, long before the COVID-19 crisis, remote working was already leading to high vacancy rates, 11% vacancy as of the third quarter of last year. Those office spaces that are surviving as office spaces have to change. And this is a view from APSA, who said that new office space has to be more aligned to flexible space, green credentials, and lower operating costs. So what's interesting about that is that it aligns perfectly with that graph I was showing you. When we come out the other end and businesses are operating digitally, that will be aligned with this approach to office space. So office spaces might be physical, but they have to take account of the digital way of working.
Arthur, has anybody told that to the developers? Because they're just putting up buildings and buildings and buildings.
I wonder what's happening with all of that, because that is really focused on the idea that South Africans were never going to move to online shopping, and that the mall was still the watering hole of the average South African. But there's one other category of property of development that is thriving at the moment, and that's industrial property. So according to one expert, but he reflects the views that I'm hearing across the board, there's 3 major factors giving industrial property a boost. Firstly, because there is no shortage of property, to get tenants to take large spaces, massive incentives are being offered. So there's never been a better time to take space. Also, as a result of COVID-19 and global supply chains being so disrupted, more and more production is going local. And local production facilities are ramping up, in fact. So manufacturers who suffered heavily in the early months of lockdown are probably going to find themselves booming as they replace reliance on imports and manufacture from China in particular. And then thirdly, e-commerce has had a massive boost. And the numbers are dependent on who you listen to. But you speak to someone like a deal a day, or what? No, it's called One Day Only. One Day Only is a daily deals site. They've had a 40% increase in their business. It's required a 40% increase in their headcount as well since lockdown began. They're absolutely booming. Then you look at Mr. Price. Their online retail offering has gone up 90%, which is staggering when you think about it. I'll show you those numbers in a moment, actually, and I'll talk you through that as well. But those figures tell you why e-commerce fulfillment is suddenly one of the hot areas of our economy. And e-commerce fulfillment requires more than 3 times the space of traditional retail sales in terms of warehousing and temporary storage. Retail sales tend to rely on fulfillment directly from the factory. They call it just-in-time inventory, whereas e-commerce has got to go to a holding space first before it gets sent out. The biggest online retailer in South Africa is Takealot. And you might think it's a great business because they don't have to hold stock, but you've got to go to their warehouse and their distribution center in Kempton Park to see what a massive warehousing facility looks like. Using robotics as a tool to help them cope with the massive demand on their services. It's like it's almost like a factory printing money, except it's bringing in products and sending out products all the time. Okay, from a health point of view, this then is again the bad news. Everyone talks about telehealth and remote consulting, and that's the new way of doing things, and COVID-19 has speeded it up. The problem is, concepts are great, but you can't actually take them as medicine. This is the reality. This is actually the present of our health system, and is also the near future of our health system. Because of the rampant corruption and mismanagement and misappropriation of funds, we still sit with this situation when we should actually be sitting with health facilities of the future where people don't actually have to queue up. So the only difference between this picture taken, I think, last year and the situation today is that everyone will be wearing masks today, but they're still having to line up in the same way. So in the same way that remote working is about the privilege of having the tools to do so, so is remote health. And then education, the same thing. The digital divide became a digital gulf as a result of highlighting the extent to which the haves could have remote learning, but the have-nots simply had to stay away from school. It is what it is, but this is what we have to do about it. We have to prepare not only for blended learning, but also for the jobs of the future. And we have to have computer literacy from the start. Today, matrics are doing calculus, which we couldn't have imagined a generation ago, when just the move from arithmetic to mathematics seemed advanced. Now they're talking about calculus. The next generation will be talking about artificial intelligence or AI. So we are in a situation where it's dire and it highlights the inequalities, but it also is now an opportunity to say, okay, we have to invest in the future because the crisis has shown us how badly we need to do so and why there are no excuses not to do so any longer. Okay, from there, we're going to move to...
Today on the radio, one economist was saying that post-COVID-19, well, whenever what that is, inflation is going to run rampant because of supply and demand. When people suddenly have the ability to go out and shop till they drop. I personally didn't understand it because people can still go out and shop till they drop right now. So it didn't make sense.
Absolutely. It doesn't make sense to me either, but there's a few things I never forecast. One is inflation, the other is exchange rates. And the third one is actually the stock market. You cannot forecast exactly what's going to happen. But the one thing that I firmly believe is that there will be a real stock market crash once the extent of the recession becomes obvious. And also in a recession, you don't have inflation. So I don't see where that conclusion is coming from. But then again, there's the old saying, if you laid all the economists in the world end to end, they still wouldn't reach a conclusion. So you speak to two economists and get two completely divergent viewpoints. From there, I'm going to move to retail. I said I would talk about retail stats. This is our picture of what retail looks like today. We think that everyone has moved to selling face masks and manufacturing face masks. But in fact, there's quite a vibrant online retail scene happening at the moment. And Mr. Price is actually the greatest example of an e-commerce success story. In April 2020, when they had to shut down their stores, sales were down 89%. May to June, when they went to online retail and they were allowed to sell clothes again, except in May, you could only sell long sleeve short t-shirts, not short sleeve t-shirts, and you couldn't sell open-toed sandals or something absurd like that. That's probably one of the most ridiculous sets of regulations we've ever seen. And the people responsible still haven't shown their faces since then, including the guy who tried to define exactly what e-commerce can and can't be allowed, and in fact tried to ban e-commerce for a while. I've even forgotten his name because he hasn't surfaced again since that whole debacle, not since the beginning of June. But anyway, May and June, sorry?
Patel or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
May and June saw their sales up 12% over last year in terms of online retail. Sorry, that was the overall retail was up 12% on last year. Online retail was up 90% on the same period last year. That's one of the most staggering levels of growth we've ever seen in an existing online retail provider and what you might call a traditional retailer who also operates online. We've never seen that kind of increase before. And Mr. Price apparel and Mr. Price sports sales doubled online, 100% up. Those are the star performers of the online operation. And the key to that was omni-channel, which means that you serve your customers in every channel in which they want to be served. And that's really the key to that digital future we talked about in the beginning. When we come out of the recession, when companies will have moved to a digital way of operating, omni-channel is going to be one of the absolute essential success factors for that digital way of work in the future. So that starts giving you a sense of where there are rays of hope, and I'm going to show you another of those rays of hope quickly. In the events business, which Mandi, for you is utterly relevant. You are making the transition, but it's obviously proving difficult. You're not attracting as many people to these events as to your physical events, but that's also because you're having them every day. So it has to build up over time. But I'm going to show you what the event space can look like and to show you that there are bright spots in this economy. So this, some of you may recognize, that's the Drum Cafe at work. And the top is the Drum Cafe performers, and the bottom is one of their typical audiences. A bunch of executives in suits and ties, all going wild and drumming. This is a standard kind of scene at their events. That just happens to be one of their bigger events. I know that picture must make you feel very uncomfortable because there are no masks and there's no social distancing. But that's really how the world used to be before COVID-19. Now look where they're going. This is an online event. If you look at the second square from the top left-hand corner, that's the performers operating from a virtual environment, or at least a socially distanced environment, where there isn't an audience in front of them, but the audience is entirely on a screen that they are performing to. And every participant in this event is also beating their drums in the same way that those men in suits and ties were doing in the audience. And the Drum Cafe has found a new lease on life. They can actually conduct far more events, and not necessarily with far more people, but over time actually interacting with even more people. And those people in their own homes suddenly also have something to keep them motivated and excited. So it's a great motivational vehicle. And I think the entire events industry can learn from what they are doing. So those are just some examples of the brighter spots. But then I'm going to show you a few graphs also of what it looks like when you're able to transition and when you can't transition. I call this pivot versus non-pivot. And let's share that screen quickly. So pivot versus non-pivot looks like this, and you'll know the first of these two names very well. That is the share performance of Uber on the US stock market from the beginning of the year to today. And the green color indicates that the share price is higher today than it was at the beginning of the year. But it's not much higher. It's just managing to keep above water. Look at the dip in that graph that represents the middle of March 2020. That's when the crisis really hit and the stock market had its first crash. Uber crashed along with everybody else, and they then made quite a good recovery, and they've carried on recovering ever since. And the reason for that, for a company that you would think would be in deep trouble because ride sharing is no longer happening, people don't need to go to work, etc., is because they were able to pivot. Their food delivery service that had been running for quite some time, Uber Eats, became the heart of the business. And Uber Eats, in fact, became the byword for ordering in. And that's what enabled Uber to survive. This is in contrast to their biggest rival in the United States, and that is Lyft. Look what happened to Lyft. Also had that big crash in the middle of March, also made a recovery and kind of steadily grew, but then started declining again. And right now they're deep underwater, they're in deep trouble, and they don't have that pivot. So that's the difference between an organization that's able to pivot and one that can't pivot. Pivot traditionally means that you change your business model almost overnight. That's not quite what Uber did, but they took a different aspect of their business model and they made that the prime business model for now. When they come out of the crisis, they'll be able to resume their other activities. Lyft has to hope that they'll survive the crisis in order to resume those other activities. And then in terms of the technology future, I'm now going to show you a few graphs that when I first analyzed them, it actually blew my mind in terms of the shape of the future as driven by technology. And this is again contrasting two organizations, two very, very different organizations with different business models and different product lines, but in fact, they compete in the exact same industry, and that is the microchip. And the company that practically invented the microchip, or the modern microchip anyway, and that dominated that industry for half a century, is a company called Intel Corporation. Their market capitalization a week or so ago in fact, last week was $258 billion, $250 billion. And their share price performing just above the level where it was at the beginning of the year. So you can see they also had that mid-March crash. They then recovered. They continued recovering very slowly, and they're now above water. So you would think, well, that's great. Intel is this giant corporation. They manufacture the chips that drive the world's computers. So of course they would survive because people always need computers. But now I want to show you their rival, a company called NVIDIA. Look where NVIDIA was at the beginning of the year, and look where they are today. So they had a mild crash in March, but relative to general performance, you could hardly call that a crash. It was actually a dip. So all NVIDIA had was a dip. And there was a very clear reason for that. NVIDIA makes the chips that drive gaming computers. They make what are called graphic processing units, GPUs, whereas Intel makes CPUs, computer processing units. So the difference between a CPU and a GPU is that the CPU runs a regular computer and a GPU runs a high-performance computer, because any gaming computer has to be a high-performance machine. So their chips were geared towards these performance machines. And that's what initially enabled them to buck the trend, because there was a very strong awareness when the market crashed that gaming companies were thriving at the time. They're amongst the few categories of companies that were really doing well. And their share prices also were completely resilient against the crash, and those companies grew. But NVIDIA, as the chip maker that supplies the machines that run those games, also was able to buck the trend as a result. And then it just carried on growing. But now there's a reason for that, an additional reason for that growth. And that is because a realization dawned on the market that these GPUs, these graphic chips, are also ideal for processing artificial intelligence on computers. The Intel chips can do so, and Intel does have supercomputer chips that can process artificial intelligence, but those are specialist, highly expensive chips, whereas with NVIDIA, their regular chips perform that role. So in effect, NVIDIA are creating the chips that are already powering the computers of the future, whereas Intel are creating the chips that are powering the computers of the past. And I'm going to show you a long-term picture of Intel versus NVIDIA to show you what the real impact of that is, because what I'm showing you now is just a response to the crisis. But look at the historic growth of these two companies. That's Intel's stock market performance from as far back as these charts were being kept, and that as far back as Intel was on the stock market. So you can see that they're actually below their all-time peak, which was in the year 2000, before the great tech stock bubble burst in, I think it was March or April 2000. And every tech company in the world basically crashed. Many went out of business. It was far worse in the tech industry in 2000 than it is today so far. If the recession continues deepening, we're probably going to see something similar happening to many tech companies. But then look how long it took Intel to come back to its historic high. So it reached that high in 2000. You can see by how quickly that it attained that high that it was an inflated price and then crashed back to normal. But then it took almost the next 20 years to get back to a level close to that high. And finally, it's there, but only just. And it's just managing to keep its head above water. Now look at NVIDIA. NVIDIA has only been listed for 20 years, but in the same 20 years it took for Intel to recover, look where NVIDIA has gone. And the high performance that we're seeing now is not exactly new. We saw it in 2018, end of 2018 as well. Probably that's when there was a massive rush on gaming computers for the holiday market. It then fell back again, but then started rising, not with COVID-19, but at the beginning of 2019, it started improving again and carried on increasing, and then through the COVID-19 crisis to massive highs today. But the most significant thing I want to show you here is that NVIDIA, which 5 years ago was a company worth a few $1 billion, compared to the market cap of Intel. Intel, market capitalization, $258 billion, near its all-time high. NVIDIA, market capitalization, $256 billion. They almost neck and neck at the moment. And you can see the long-term trend line that NVIDIA is going to shoot past Intel. And this past month, the month of July 2020, probably represents the month that NVIDIA overtakes Intel as the most valuable chip maker in the world. And this represents a watershed in the history of the microchip, but also in the history of what drives the future. And what drives the future is clearly artificial intelligence in terms of expectations of what will make the biggest impact on technology in the coming years. So that was quite a long-winded way of telling you that the next 10 years will be heavily dictated from a technology point of view by advances in artificial intelligence, but also the uses to which people are able to put artificial intelligence.
Arthur, we've got a couple of comments. Colleen says,
yes.
Post-COVID, my company will be allowing the majority to keep on working from home. We are moving to smaller offices and reducing office space as a result of this. She said, I work for a company that was able to pivot. That's the buzzword at the moment. My company provides software to the logistics world. A lot of our customers couldn't trade, so we focused on finding new clients in last mile space, so home deliveries.
That's fantastic. That's exactly what it takes. And every one of the things that Colleen has said really sums up that digital imperative that I was talking about in the beginning, where companies have to operate in a digital way. From an office space point of view, a smarter use of office space. It says smaller offices, reducing office space, but also that, no doubt, Colleen, goes hand in hand with working digitally where possible and where necessary. So I imagine that it's a very digitally oriented office. And then also providing software to the logistics world. What a great industry to be supplying. There's massive opportunity now in streamlining logistics and fine-tuning logistics. So I would say you in one of the best industries that you could be in South Africa right now.
Karen says, Arthur, what would you recommend the schoolgoers of today look for in careers given this new world order?
Hi, Karen. We've often talked in the physical world, but in this space, if you're already finishing school, it's too late to decide what your emphasis at school is going to be, but you have a big opportunity at university to shape your studies in a direction that will feed into that future. And I come back to that same term I used earlier, which is artificial intelligence. In fact, a lot of people come to me for career advice, and it's almost a drum that I beat. I sound like I'm marketing someone's artificial intelligence services, but I'm not. It's just obvious. The NVIDIA versus Intel graph just underlines for me and confirms for me what I've been picking up for the past year or two, that artificial intelligence is going to be so dominant in every industry that if you can tag that on to whatever your interests and passions are, you're going to benefit massively from it. So if you're going to actuarial science, for example, and you can bring artificial intelligence into that, not necessarily as a programmer, but certainly understanding the strategy behind it or the business models or the use cases, then that's going to enhance your ability to perform as an actuary, for example. In health, if you're studying medicine, then understanding the benefits of artificial intelligence in diagnostics is going to be massive. I'm actually quite depressed at the amount of medical people I encounter who don't want anything to do with telemedicine or artificial intelligence. Why? They're not saying so, but I can see they feel that these are tools that undermine their authority, rather than seeing it as something that will help them do their job better. And I, as a patient, want them to use those tools to diagnose and prescribe better to me as well. Why aren't you using these incredibly advanced tools that will help make me healthier just because of your bloody ego? That's exactly how I see it. I see it as an egotistical thing. But just to get back to the question, in terms of careers, and specifically, it's not a case of what career you should look for, but rather what approach you should take to the career that interests you. Clearly, you don't want to look for a career that's already part of history. There are certain careers that you don't want to pursue that are already being replaced by robots or by what they call robotic process automation, which is software robots. You don't want to, I don't suppose people do aspire to a career in call centers, but I certainly wouldn't look for a job or try to qualify myself in being a call center operative, because that is going to be completely disrupted by bots or robotic process automation, for example. But it's not really what jobs will be done away with. It's how jobs will be enhanced by these new tools. And that's really the advice. So I can't tell you what career to go into. The traditional advice is you should pursue your passions. And I personally believe strongly in that. But augment those passions with these emerging tools. And then,
Arthur,
yes.
will you speculate on the effects of the US election?
I'd hate to speculate. If Trump wins, then America is in very deep trouble. I know that there are a lot of people who love Trump because he's good for this or he's good for that. But the truth is, I've never seen such almost irretrievably nasty and destructive person running such a powerful country in my lifetime. In other people's lifetime, there have been a few of those. But to see the country that's supposed to be the leader of the free world being led by someone like that is so depressing that I believe that if he wins the election, that America will reap the damage of that for generations to come.
Sorry,
how but beyond that, I can't speculate.
Your website to shoppers.
Sorry. How important is the appeal of your website to shoppers? Is the question. It's very important because when people go looking online for a product, they are also going to want to trust the provider of that product. And the shabbier your website, from an aesthetics point of view as well as a usability point of view, the less likely they are to trust you. So it's not a question of how good your products are. It's a question of how well you come across to your customer. A term that you'll hear a lot in the next few years is customer experience. And that is driving corporate strategy. And part of the basis for digital transformation before COVID-19 was to ensure that there's a seamless customer experience. And even a small business has to embrace that reality and that principle.
Arthur, wouldn't you say, though, that unless you are doing online e-commerce, a website is passé in this day and age?
No, not at all, because people are still relying heavily on Google to search for products and to compare products as well. Both search and price comparisons are driven heavily by Google. And if you don't have a website, you're not going to appear. Sorry?
When my mother wants something, she asks Joburg Jewish mummies. She doesn't go into Google.
But guess where Joburg Jewish mummies are going?
To their husbands.
Well, the fact that she's going to that forum means she's going onto Facebook. So someone is still going to link her to unless they know someone personally that they can connect it to, they're typically going to give her a link of where to find something. And
what about a return to simpler things? Farming, carpentry, cooking, working with your hands. And for example, I am baking bread and it's gaining popularity. It's very nice bread. The loaf didn't make it home yesterday.
I'm sure it is. I'd love to try it, but the question is, can you make a living from that? You can certainly feed yourself for that, but you've got to earn a living and you've got to educate your son or put him through education. And baking bread probably won't be enough for that unless you find a secret recipe that addicts everybody and they can't do without it. Like Paul's ice cream is probably a good example.
It's a fantastic ice cream. It's not a fantastic ice cream. It's a fantastic example of how somebody did well. I mean, do you remember when he started? He used to hawk his ice cream around Parkhurst and come and deliver these little 200 ml tubs.
Yeah. It's also an example of where having good investors and good partners also helps tremendously. But the point there is, if you can get the bread equivalent of Paul's ice cream, then yeah, by all means. But just in terms of generally doing it as a home industry, it's not viable if you want to make a living and you want to put your kids through university.
Sorry, Karen.
But your Kitka's divine.
You and me are screwed. Lucky I don't have kids to put through school.
Yeah. And as Colleen says, before I buy anything, I Google it. I read all the reviews. So that's going to be the way most people do their shopping. Instead of browsing shelves, they're going to be browsing the web. So it's not enough to just have a WhatsApp number where people can contact you.
Damn it. Got to spend money on a website now.
Sorry.
That's okay. You offered to do it for nothing, didn't you?
Yeah, she still lives in Yeovil.
No. Victory Park. Oh, he's moved up in the world, hey? Arthur, has anybody else got any more questions for Arthur before we let him get on with his life this evening? Because I'm too depressed. I'm too depressed. No, I'm too depressed now to actually think about anything else, quite frankly. Last night's talk with Tony Marcus about accounting and the receiver of revenue was enough to make one depressed. You've compounded the issue. Thankfully, tomorrow night we're doing arts and crafts with upcycling. Oh, really? A bit of light.
Here's the upside, Mandy. Part of the reason that I want to make you depressed is actually not to make you sad, but to make you more digitally awake. That's the theme that I'm driving quite hard. My column tomorrow in Gadget is called The Digital Awakening. So have a look at that. And what it underlines is the fact that by embracing the digital means of doing things, you'll find eventually that you can become far more efficient in this world than you were in the physical world at doing the stuff you were doing anyway. Maybe not baking bread, Karen, sorry, and maybe not carpentry and the like, but certainly anything that can be done digitally can be done far more effectively in this space than in the physical space. And I hope that your initiative to have these daily events will eventually turn into an industry, because it has the potential, which you could never have done from your garden.
No. Well, exactly. This is one of those businesses that pivoted. So instead of just doing an event once a weekend, exactly, we now do them 6 days or 5 days a week, and the response has actually been really good. So I'm not too depressed. I just need 30 people to renew every week, and that would be me earning a living.
Renew, everyone, renew.
Renew, everyone, renew. Exactly. Renew your subs every week. Arthur, thank you very much. It's been fantastic as always seeing you. We didn't even talk about your passion for street art, which we're going to have to come back and do as well. Are you still passionate about it?
Still am. Just don't get to see much of it at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe when the world opens up again, we'll have you online again and we'll talk about street art. Brilliant platform. So thank you, Mandy. Thank you for a lovely talk. Thank you, everybody. Join us tomorrow evening. Can't wait to see you all. Have a fantastic evening and good night.
Sleep tight.